The radio crackled with static, then silence. That kind of silence that makes experienced soldiers check their weapons twice. Colonel Marcus Harlan stood in the temporary operations center, his jaw tight as he stared at the flickering tactical display. 12 green dots, pinned down in a valley that intelligence had sworn was clear. Intelligence was wrong. It usually was. Outside, the Afghan sun beat down on forward operating base Kestrel with the kind of heat that made mirages dance on the tarmac. Harlan could see her out there through the reinforced glass, walking that pre-flight circle around the ugliest aircraft ever to grace a military runway. The Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II looked like it had been designed by someone who hated beauty and loved function with a religious fervor. Twin turbofan engines mounted high on the rear fuselage, a cockpit wrapped in titanium bathtub armor, and that distinctive nose housing a 30mm GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon that could shred a tank like paper. Captain Riven Locke moved with practiced economy, her flight suit showing the wear of too many missions and not enough maintenance time. The other pilots called her Graveyard behind her back, though none of them could quite agree on why. Some said it was because she flew the night missions no one else wanted. Others whispered it was because she'd walked away from a crash that should have killed her in Kandahar 3 years back, while her weapons systems officer hadn't. Harlan knew the real reason, but that was buried in a classified file he'd only read once before locking it away in his mind. The situation map told a story written in blood and bad decisions. 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, had pushed into the Korangal Valley following what should have been reliable human. Instead, they'd walked into a carefully prepared kill zone. Taliban fighters held the high ground on 3 sides, with heavy machine guns and RPGs turning the valley floor into a shooting gallery. 2 Humvees were already burning, sending black smoke into the crystalline sky. The QRF choppers couldn't get in. The enemy had shoulder-fired SAMs, and helicopter pilots had families to go home to. Fast movers from Bagram were 20 minutes out, which might as well have been 20 hours. Harlan lifted the radio handset, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. His orders from division were clear: consolidate, minimize exposure, prepare for tactical withdrawal. 12 men weren't worth losing more. Wars were won by commanders who knew when to cut their losses. But those 12 green dots had names, families, and the belief that someone would come for them. He pressed the button. "Graveyard, this is Overwatch Actual." The response came immediately, that Carolina drawl turned professional and clipped. "Graveyard copies, Actual. We have 12 souls in the valley. Situation critical, surrounded, heavy fire. Air support is delayed. We're pulling back to defensible positions." He paused, the weight of command sitting heavy on his shoulders. "I need you to provide cover for the withdrawal. Keep their heads down while our people extract." Static hissed for 3 seconds. "Copy that, Actual, covering fire for extraction." Another pause. "Request permission to go full loadout." Harlan glanced at the ordnance board. She was already carrying enough firepower to level a small town. Maverick missiles, Hydra rockets, the GAU-8 with its 1,350 rounds of depleted uranium penetrators. "Negative, Graveyard. This is cover fire only. Get them out, come home clean." "Understood, Actual. Graveyard is rolling." Through the window, he watched her climb the ladder into that flying tank. The ground crew pulled the chocks, and the twin General Electric TF-34 turbofans spooled up with their characteristic whine. Not the impressive roar of an F-16, but the determined growl of something built to take punishment and keep flying. The A-10 began its taxi, slow and deliberate, like a predator that knew rushing was for the desperate. What Harlan didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Riven Locke had already decided this would not be a withdrawal. She'd read the tactical situation, run the calculations in her head, and come to a different conclusion. Sometimes the book was wrong. Sometimes you had to write your own ending, even if your name ended up on a monument wall instead of a commendation certificate. The valley waited, unaware that judgment was coming at 350 knots, low and angry. The Korangal Valley had earned its reputation over decades of conflict. The Soviets had bled here. American forces had learned respect for its treacherous terrain the hard way. Deep gorges cut between mountains that rose like broken teeth toward an indifferent sky, creating natural fortifications that turned every advance into a calculated risk. Local fighters knew every cave, every trail, every position that commanded a killing field. They'd been born in these mountains, would die in these mountains, and had no intention of surrendering them to outsiders wearing different flags and speaking different languages. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb pressed himself against a boulder that was probably older than Christianity, trying to make his 6-foot frame disappear behind insufficient cover. Blood soaked through his uniform sleeve where shrapnel had opened a gash from shoulder to elbow. It hurt less than his pride. He'd walked his platoon straight into an ambush that a boot private should have seen coming. The Taliban had let them advance deep into the valley, past the point where retreat was easy, then dropped the hammer from positions that controlled every exit. Specialist Ramirez lay 3 feet away, working the radio with increasingly desperate calls for support. Any station, this is Bravo 2-6, we are taking heavy fire from multiple positions, over. His voice stayed professional, but Webb could hear the edge underneath. They were all feeling it, that creeping certainty that this mission had gone from routine to remembered. The incoming fire had a rhythm to it now. 3-round bursts from the PKM machine guns on the eastern ridge, RPGs lobbed in high arcs to airburst above their position, sporadic AK fire from fighters who were either brave or stupid enough to expose themselves on the northern slope. Webb's remaining soldiers returned fire when they had targets, but mostly they were conserving ammunition and waiting for someone to change the equation. Bravo 2-6, this is Overwatch Actual. The colonel's voice cut through the static like a clean blade. We're working your problem. Fast movers inbound, 20 mics. QRF is spooling up for extraction once the DZ is secure. Hold position and maintain defensive posture. 20 minutes. Webb did the math on remaining ammunition, casualty status, and enemy aggression level. It didn't add up to survival. Copy that. Actual, we'll be here. No point telling command they were fucked. They had radios, they could hear the same gunfire. Then a different voice came through, female, with an accent that suggested barbecue and college football. Bravo 2-6, this is Graveyard. I'm inbound your position, 5 mics. Gonna need you to mark your perimeter and stay low. This could get loud. Webb exchanged glances with Ramirez. Graveyard, Bravo 2-6, are you fast movers? Please be F-18s, he thought. Please be something with speed and standoff weapons. Negative, I'm an A-10, single ship coming down Main Street. Ramirez's eyes went wide. 1. Against an entrenched enemy with air defense. That was either the bravest thing he'd heard or the dumbest. Maybe both. Copy. Graveyard. Our perimeter is marked with IR strobes. Enemy positions are danger close, most within 200 meters. They've got stingers up there. Acknowledged. Keep your heads down, boys. Graveyard is going to work. Webb pulled out his IR strobe and activated it, the invisible pulse marking their position for anyone with night vision or FLIR. Others around the perimeter did the same. Above them, the sky was that peculiar shade of blue you only get in high-altitude desert regions, empty, except for a few clouds that seemed to mock their situation with their serenity. Then he heard it, a sound like an industrial fan crossed with a turbine coming from the south, growing louder. Webb raised his head just enough to see over the boulder. There, skimming the ridgeline at what couldn't be more than 200 feet, came the most beautiful, ugly thing he'd ever seen. The A-10 looked impossibly low, its gray camouflage paint blending with the mountain stone, until it seemed like a piece of the terrain had learned to fly. It came in fast, but not fighter jet fast. This was the speed of something that wanted to see its targets clearly before it killed them. The twin engines screamed in that distinctive tone, announcing death with a mechanical voice that had no mercy in it. Webb saw the wings, straight, thick, and loaded with ordnance that made his mouth go dry. Missiles hung from hardpoints like promises. Rocket pods bristled with 70-millimeter warheads. And beneath the nose, that cannon, the GAU-8 Avenger, designed specifically to destroy Soviet tanks and now pointed at men who'd made the mistake of shooting at American soldiers. "Graveyard has tally on enemy positions," the voice said, calm as someone ordering coffee. "Commencing gun run on the eastern ridge. Danger close, heads down." Webb dropped behind the boulder and pressed his face into the dirt. He heard the gun before he understood what he was hearing. It wasn't individual shots. It was a sound that defied description, a mechanical roar, a buzzsaw that could cut the world in half, the BRRRRRRRRRRT that had become legend among ground troops lucky enough to hear it directed at someone else. 30-millimeter depleted uranium rounds ripped into the eastern ridge at a rate of 65 per second. Each round carried kinetic energy that turned rock into shrapnel and human beings into fragments too small for burial. The Taliban machine gun nest that had been controlling their eastern flank simply ceased to exist, along with the men who'd manned it and a portion of the mountain itself. The A-10 climbed away, banking hard right, already lining up for another pass. Webb lifted his head, ears ringing, mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. The eastern ridge, which had been alive with muzzle flashes and incoming fire, was now silent and smoking. "Bravo 2-6, Graveyard. How's that first course? I've got 9 more servings ready." Webb keyed his radio, his voice cracking slightly. "Graveyard, that's good effects on target. Eastern ridge is neutralized." He found himself grinning despite everything, despite the blood and the fear. "We might just make it out of here." "That's the plan, soldier. Graveyard's just getting started. Switching to northern position, stand by." They came around again, this time approaching from the west. Riven Locke had spotted the RPG teams on the northern slope, 3 groups, widely dispersed, using natural depressions for cover. They'd been the source of the airburst explosions that had kept Webb's platoon pinned and bleeding. She armed the Hydra rockets, selected the leftmost group, and squeezed the trigger. 7 rockets streaked away from the pod, leaving white smoke trails as they covered the distance in under 2 seconds. They impacted in a rippling chain of explosions that walked across the slope like the footsteps of an angry god. The RPG team disappeared in fire and shrapnel, their weapons cooking off with secondary explosions that sent additional debris tumbling down the mountainside. She didn't wait to assess. Training and instinct guided her hands as she jammed the throttles forward and pulled hard left, though responding with the grace of something that knew its job was to be ugly and effective, not pretty. Tracer fire arced up from another position. Someone down there had a DSHK heavy machine gun and the balls to use it. The green tracers walked toward her aircraft, close enough that she could track their path through her peripheral vision. Riven rolled, inverted, and pulled, using gravity and engine power to dive away from the tracers. The titanium bathtub around her cockpit could handle hits from most ground fire, but there was no point in testing its limits if she could avoid it. The G-forces pressed her into her seat, the G-suit inflating around her legs and abdomen to keep blood in her brain. She'd done this so many times it felt like breathing, but the adrenaline still sang through her veins, sharp and electric. Rolling level at 50 feet, criminally low, dangerously low, the kind of low that made tactical officers write up safety reports. She spotted the DSHK position. It was well camouflaged, positioned behind sandbags and rocks, but the muzzle flash gave it away. More importantly, she could see the 4 men serving it, their faces turning up toward her aircraft with expressions she couldn't distinguish but could imagine. She selected one of her AGM-65 Mavericks, let the seeker head lock onto the heat signature, and fired. The missile dropped away from the wing, its motor igniting almost immediately. It covered the 300 meters to target in seconds, striking the DSHK position with the kind of precision that would have impressed the engineers who designed it decades ago. The explosion erased the gun, the crew, and the entire section of mountainside they'd been using. Graveyard Bravo 26. God damn, those are good hits. Northern positions are getting quiet. Southern Ridge is still active, multiple shooters. I see them. And she did, her eyes, trained by hundreds of hours in this exact scenario, picked out the firing positions by the dust their muzzle blast kicked up. 6 positions, maybe 7, spread across a ridgeline that provided excellent cover and overlapping fields of fire. These were the ones that had them truly pinned. Taking them out would require multiple passes, exposing her to whatever air defense they had left, burning fuel and ordnance she might need for the extraction. Or she could do something smarter, something they wouldn't expect, something that would make Harlan put her in for court-martial or a medal, depending on how it played out. She pulled up hard, gaining altitude while she still had the energy, climbing to 5,000 feet above the valley floor. Up here, she was more vulnerable to MA and PADs if they had them, but she also had options. Overwatch Actual Graveyard, requesting permission to employ precision fires on southern ridge positions. Multiple confirmed enemy, entrenched, commanding overwatch on our troops. The colonel's voice came back tight and controlled. Graveyard Actual, that's affirmative for precision fires. Keep it surgical. QRF is still 15 mics out and we need that DZ clear. Copy that, going surgical. Riven rolled the A-10 inverted again. This orientation gave her the best view of the ground directly beneath her while maintaining awareness of the horizon. The southern ridge spread out below her canopy like a topographical map. She picked her targets carefully. The RPG team that was repositioning for another shot. The PKM nest that had maintained sustained fire for the last 10 minutes. The cluster of fighters that looked like a command element, distinctive by their spacing and the way others oriented toward them. She rolled upright, lined up her approach, and began what pilots called the dance. A series of passes, each one calculated to maximize effects while minimizing exposure. The A-10 Dove fired, climbed, repositioned, dove again. The GAU-8 spoke in its terrible voice, carving precision into chaos. Rockets streaked away to explode against stone and flesh. The Mavericks, expensive and accurate, took out the high-value targets that required special attention. Between passes, she checked her fuel and ordnance. Both were dropping faster than ideal, but still within acceptable parameters. Her hands moved with automatic precision across the controls, muscle memory built from thousands of hours turning thought into action without conscious delay. Below, Webb and his platoon were no longer pinned. They were fighting back, taking advantage of the chaos to shift positions, consolidate, and establish proper defensive sectors. The radio chatter had changed tone, still professional, still urgent, but with an undercurrent of hope that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. Graveyard Bravo 26, you've given us breathing room. We're preparing to move to the extraction point on your mark. Negative Bravo 26, stay put. We're not extracting, we're sanitizing. Riven's voice carried an edge that made Webb grip his rifle tighter. Every hostile in this valley is a threat to the next patrol that comes through. We're not leaving until they're not a threat anymore. There was a pause. Graveyard, confirm your last. Did you say you're staying until the valley is clear? That's affirmative. I didn't come all this way just to let them regroup and do this to someone else next week. We're finishing this. In the TOC, Colonel Harlan stood frozen, the radio handset in his hand, his brain trying to process what he'd just heard. Captain Locke had just declared her intention to single-handedly sanitize an enemy-held valley, in direct contradiction to the tactical withdrawal he'd ordered. He should recall her immediately, should order her to RTB and face whatever disciplinary action this warranted, should remind her that individual heroics got people killed and created more problems than they solved. Instead, he watched the tactical display as the enemy signals began winking out, one by one, replaced by nothing but silence. He listened to the radio chatter from Webb's platoon, heard the disbelief turning into something else, something that sounded like faith. Graveyard Overwatch Actual. He kept his voice level command neutral. Be advised your fuel state. Copy Actual, I'm tracking my fuel. I have 25 mics before bingo, that's enough time. And if it's not, then I'll make it be enough. No bravado in her voice, just statement of fact. Harlan set down the handset and turned to his operations officer, Captain Vance, who was staring at him with wide eyes. Sir, are we really letting her? We're not letting her do anything, Captain. She's already doing it. Our job now is to make sure the assets are in place for when she's done. He pointed at the display. Get me a tanker on station in case she needs to refuel. Get me SAR birds spun up in case she goes down. And get the QRF moving toward that valley at best speed because when she clears it, I want our people extracted immediately. Yes, sir. Vance moved to execute the orders, then paused. Sir, she's going to need more than a tanker if she takes a hit from a stinger. She knows that. Harlan's jaw clenched. She knows exactly what she's doing. Back in the valley, Riven was systematically destroying everything that represented a threat. She'd moved beyond the immediate positions that had engaged the platoon. Now she was hunting, looking for the support elements, the ammunition caches, the fallback positions that experienced fighters always maintained. The Taliban weren't stupid. They'd prepared this ambush carefully, which meant they had resources hidden throughout the valley. She found the first cache in a cave mouth on the western slope, betrayed by the tracks leading to it and the careful camouflage netting that looked just slightly wrong from the air. A maverick turned the cave into a tomb, secondary explosions suggesting she'd found something explosive inside. The second cache was more obvious, a cluster of pickup trucks hidden in a ravine, the kind of technical vehicles that mounted heavy weapons and provided the mobility that made ambushes possible. The GAU-8 reduced them to scrap metal in a 3-second burst that expended 90 rounds and completely justified their cost. She was lining up for another pass when her radar warning receiver screamed in her headset. Missile launch. SA-7 or similar, infrared-guided, coming from her 7 o'clock low. Training took over. She punched flares, jamming the throttles to full military power while simultaneously pulling into a climbing turn that increased her IR signature, but also got her out of the missile's best engagement envelope. The SA-7 went for the flares, exploding harmlessly 200 meters behind her. But now she knew they had MA and PADs, and they'd waited to reveal them until they had a good shot. Smart, professional, dangerous. She keyed the radio. Overwatch Graveyard. Confirm hostile MA and PAD launch, Valley Floor, Western Sector. I'm still mission capable, engaging. Copy Graveyard. Be advised, you are cleared to egress if the threat level is too high. Negative Actual. One missile means there are more. If I leave now, the QRF choppers fly into that. I'm finding them all. She had maybe 15 minutes of fuel before she'd need to start thinking about the trip back to Kestrel. 15 minutes to find and destroy an unknown number of shoulder-fired missiles hidden somewhere in a 10-square-kilometer valley. It was impossible. She'd do it anyway. The trick was thinking like her enemy. If she had MA and PADs and new air support was coming, where would she position them? High ground for better engagement angles, near the escape route so she could cover her people as they withdrew. Protected positions that could survive near misses from aerial fires. She found the first team repositioning along a goat trail that wound up the northern ridge. 2 men, one carrying the missile tube, the other with a pack that probably held reloads. They looked up as her shadow crossed them, faces turning pale as they realized they'd been spotted. The GAU-8 spoke briefly, and the goat trail became just a trail again. The second team was harder. They'd learned from watching their comrades die, had gone to ground in a spot with overhead concealment from scrub trees. but they'd gotten excited when they saw her hunting their friends, had moved to get a better shot, and that movement had given them away. A single Hydra rocket was overkill for 2 men, but she was conserving the big gun's ammunition and couldn't afford to miss. The rocket found them, and the trees that had hidden them became kindling. Fuel gauge dropping, weapons nearly expended, body aching from the G-forces and the adrenaline crash that was starting to whisper at the edges of her consciousness. But the valley was quiet now. The radio chatter from Webb's platoon confirmed it. No more incoming fire. No more threats. Just silence and smoke and the particular stillness that comes to a battlefield when one side has decisively won. Bravo 26 Graveyard. I'm Winchester on most systems and approaching bingo fuel. Valley appears clear for your extraction. QRF should be inbound. Copy that, Graveyard. Webb's voice had changed. The fear was gone, replaced by something else. Awe, maybe, respect. We're moving to the extraction point now, and Graveyard, thank you. You saved our lives today. Just doing my job, Sergeant. Get your people home safe. She turned the A-10 south, toward Kestrel, the aircraft feeling lighter now with its weapons mostly expended. Behind her, the Korangal Valley was returning to its ancient silence, 13 fewer fighters than it had held an hour ago. In her mind, she was already running the after-action review, cataloging what had worked and what needed improvement. Standard procedure. Professional detachment. But her hands were shaking slightly on the stick, and she allowed herself 3 deep breaths to let the adrenaline drain away before she started her approach. 3 breaths to be human before she had to be a pilot again. Overwatch, Graveyard. Mission complete, RTB. Copy that, Graveyard. Tower is expecting you. And Captain, Harlan's voice held a note she couldn't quite identify. Well done. The fob came into view, a collection of temporary structures and revetments that represented civilization in a place that rejected it. Riven began her landing checks, the familiar routine calming her hands and steadying her breathing. Gear down, 3 green lights, flaps set, airspeed on profile. The A-10 settled onto the runway with its typical firm landing. The aircraft wasn't built for graceful touchdowns, just survivable ones. She taxied to her revetment, the ground crew already moving to secure the aircraft. When she shut down the engines, the sudden silence was profound. She sat in the cockpit for a moment, hands still on the controls, letting the mission settle into memory where it would join all the others. Then she popped the canopy and climbed down, her legs slightly unsteady on the ladder. The heat hit her like a physical force, the Afghan sun unforgiving. The ground crew chief, Technical Sergeant Torres, was doing his walk around, his face a study in professional concern as he counted the empty hardpoints. Ma'am, you weren't supposed to bring her back empty. Riven pulled off her helmet, letting her dark hair fall free. Had to make sure the groceries got delivered, Torres. She performed okay. Aircraft solid. You've got some scoring on the belly armor, looks like small arms, but nothing that penetrated. Bring her back like this again, and I'm going to have words with you about my baby. Your baby, Riven smiled, the first real smile since she'd launched. I'm pretty sure I'm the one who flies her. You're just renting, Captain. I'm the one who keeps her honest. As they walked toward the operations center, Riven could see other personnel stopping their work to watch her pass. Word had already spread, it always did on a fob. The pilot who'd gone into the Korangal alone and come back with everyone. The story would get bigger with each telling, she knew. Eventually it would barely resemble what actually happened. That was fine. She'd know the truth. Colonel Harland was waiting outside the TOC, his face unreadable in the harsh sunlight. Riven snapped a salute that he returned. Then he gestured for her to follow him inside, where the air conditioning and relative quiet provided an oasis from the chaos outside. Captain Locke, we need to talk about what happened out there. Yes, sir. She kept her voice neutral, professionally ready for whatever came next. Commendation or court-martial, she'd followed her training and her instincts. She could live with either outcome. You disobeyed a direct order. I told you to provide cover for extraction. Instead, you conducted a unilateral clearance operation of an enemy-held valley, engaged multiple hardened positions, and expended 90% of your ordnance against targets I hadn't cleared. Yes, sir, that's an accurate summary. You also saved 12 lives, eliminated a significant enemy force, and cleared a valley that's been a problem for 3 months. Intelligence is estimating you took out between 30 and 40 hostiles, destroyed multiple weapons caches, and removed the Taliban's ability to use that terrain for ambushes in the foreseeable future. I was just doing my job, sir. Harlan's expression cracked slightly, something that might have been amusement showing through. Your job was to follow orders, Captain. What you did was rewrite the mission parameters based on your own tactical assessment. In any by-the-book evaluation, that's grounds for disciplinary action. I understand, sir. But, he held up one finger, wars aren't won by the book. They're won by people who know when the book is wrong and have the skill to do something about it. What you did today was reckless, insubordinate, and completely outside standard operating procedure. He paused. It was also brilliant, effective, and probably saved more lives than just those 12 men. The next patrol that goes through that valley won't walk into the same trap. Riven waited. She'd learned long ago that senior officers sometimes needed to work through their thoughts out loud. So here's what's going to happen, Harlan continued. Officially, you followed your orders to provide close air support and engage targets of opportunity that presented an immediate threat to friendly forces. Your aggressive prosecution of those targets resulted in complete mission success and 0 friendly casualties. I'm putting you in for a distinguished flying cross, and Sergeant Webb is already submitting a statement supporting it. Sir, that's not necessary. Not about necessity, Captain, it's about recognition, but unofficially. His voice hardened slightly. You ever pull something like that again without proper clearance and I will have your wings clear. Crystal clear, sir. Good. Now get to medical, get checked out, and then get some rest. You've been airborne for 2 hours and I suspect you're running on adrenaline and stubbornness. We'll do the full debrief tomorrow when your head is clear. Riven saluted again and turned to leave, but Harlan's voice stopped her at the door. Captain, why graveyard? She turned back, her expression carefully neutral. Sir. Your call sign. Everyone has a story behind their call sign. What's yours? For a moment she considered deflecting, giving him the sanitized version that most people got. But he'd backed her play today, trusted her judgment even when it contradicted orders. That bought honesty. My first deployment, Kandahar, I was flying with Captain James Ordega as my wingman. He was experienced, talented, and about 3 months from rotating home. We caught a mission that should have been routine, support a convoy through an area that intelligence said was clear. She paused, the memory still sharp after 3 years. It wasn't clear. They'd been waiting for us, had stingers positioned on both sides of the valley. Jim took a hit almost immediately. I watched his aircraft come apart, saw the chute deploy, and then watched the chute take ground fire. He was dead before he hit the earth. Harlan's face showed nothing, but his eyes betrayed his understanding. Every combat pilot had a story like this, or knew someone who did. I should have gone down too, Riven continued. Took 2 missile hits, lost hydraulics, fire in the port engine. Aircraft was telling me in every way possible that it was time to leave, but I couldn't. Not while they were still shooting at his body, so I stayed. Put every round I had into those positions, turned that valley into a graveyard. Flew that crippled bird back to Bagram on pure spite and Tor's maintenance work. When I climbed out, the other pilots were staring at the damage. Someone said I'd turned myself into a flying graveyard. The name stuck. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then Harlan nodded slowly. He'd be proud of what you did today. Maybe, or maybe he'd tell me I was an idiot for risking the same thing happening again. She smiled without humor. I hear his voice sometimes when I'm pulling GS or making a decision that's probably stupid. He usually tells me I'm overthinking it. Good instinct. Harland moved to his desk, the conversation clearly over. Dismissed, Captain. Riven left the TOC and walked toward medical, where a bored-looking corpsman would check her for injuries she didn't have and clear her for duty she'd already performed. The sun was starting its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed wrong for a place where people killed each other over territory and ideology. Around her, the fob continued its eternal rhythms, helicopters coming and going, ground crews maintaining the machines that kept everyone alive, soldiers pulling shifts, eating meals, writing letters home, and trying to carve out some normalcy in a place that resisted it. This was her world, had been for 8 years now. Not many female pilots in the pipeline when she'd started, and even fewer flying A-10s. The Warthog community was small, tight-knit, and hadn't quite known what to make of a woman who wanted to fly the ugliest, toughest close air support platform in the inventory. She'd proved herself the way everyone proved themselves, through skill, commitment, and the kind of performance that made arguments irrelevant. Still, she'd heard the whispers, heard people question whether she had the physical strength for the high-G maneuvers, the mental toughness for the danger-close missions, the aggression necessary for prosecuting targets that shot back. Today's mission would quiet some of those whispers, but she knew better than to think it would silence them all. There would always be someone ready to dismiss what she'd done, to attribute it to luck, or to diminish it in comparison to some imagined male standard. That was fine. She'd stopped flying for their approval years ago. Now she flew for the people on the ground who needed someone crazy enough to fly low and slow through enemy fire because that's what the mission required. Her thoughts drifted to Webb and his platoon, probably already back at Kestrel or on their way there, alive because she'd ignored half her orders and followed the other half in ways that would make training instructors write new case studies on what not to do. They'd go home eventually, back to families and lives where today would become a story they told or didn't tell, depending on how the memories sat. She'd still be here, climbing into that ugly gray aircraft, taking missions that needed doing because someone had to do them. It was enough. It had to be enough. At medical, the corpsman was indeed bored and perfunctory. Any injuries, Captain? Negative, just need the post-flight check. Blood pressure's elevated but within acceptable parameters. You're cleared. He made a note on his tablet. Word is you had quite a day. Just another mission, Doc. Right. He didn't believe her, but he also didn't press. Get some water, get some food, try to sleep. Standard advice for someone who's been running on adrenaline. Will do. She left medical and headed for her quarters, a small containerized housing unit that she shared with 3 other officers who were currently on duty. Inside was a narrow bed, a footlocker, a small desk, and enough personal space to function but not enough to get comfortable. Pictures taped to the wall, her family back in North Carolina, her flight school class, a few friends from previous deployments who'd moved on to other assignments or other lives. On her desk sat a photograph she didn't usually talk about. Captain James Ordega, smiling in his flight suit, taken a week before Kandahar. She picked it up, looked at the face that still showed up in her dreams sometimes. Told you I'd finish what you started, Jim. Valley's clear. Maybe the next guy through won't have to dodge stingers. The photograph didn't answer. It never did. She set it back down and stretched out on her bed, still in her flight suit, too tired to change and too wired to sleep. Her mind replayed the mission in endless loops, examining each decision, each maneuver, looking for the mistakes that would need correcting next time. Because there would be a next time. There always was. Somewhere another platoon would need help. Another valley would need clearing. Another radio call would crackle through requesting immediate assistance, and she'd strap into that titanium bathtub with wings and go do the job that needed doing. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her, falling into a sleep populated by the sounds of engines and explosions and radio chatter, the normal dreams of a combat pilot who'd learned to live in the space between danger and duty. Outside, the sun set completely, and Fob Kestrel transitioned to night operations. In the operations center, Colonel Harlan finished his after-action report, carefully noting Captain Locke's performance while downplaying the parts that might cause headquarters to ask uncomfortable questions. In the maintenance area, Torres and his crew swarmed over the A-10, patching the small arms damage and reloading weapons for tomorrow's missions. And in a barracks on the other side of the base, Sergeant Webb wrote a letter to his wife explaining why he was going to be late for their daughter's birthday, but not explaining exactly how close he'd come to never making it home at all. The valley was quiet now, empty of living enemies, but full of the ghosts that all battlefields accumulate. Eventually the mountains would reclaim the craters, the weather would fade the scorch marks, and new fighters would move into positions that older fighters had held before dying there. The war would continue, as wars do, until someone somewhere decided it was finished. But for one day, in one valley, an A-10 pilot named Riven Locke had written a different ending than the one that had seemed inevitable. She'd taken a retreat and turned it into a victory, had transformed an order to run into an order to fight, had proven again that sometimes the courage to ignore the plan is what makes the mission succeed. And somewhere in classified files that would be declassified decades later, analysts would note the Korangal Valley operation as a tactical case study in close air support, single-platform combat operations, and the importance of pilot initiative in fluid combat situations. They would make graphs and charts and presentations, reducing blood and fire to bullet points and lessons learned. They would never quite capture the moment when Webb looked up at that ugly aircraft and felt hope replace despair, or the split second when Riven made the choice to stay instead of run, knowing it might be the choice that got her killed, or the sound of the GAU-8 speaking its terrible truth to an enemy that had thought they were safe. Some things don't fit in after-action reports. Some moments resist analysis. Some days, you just had to be there to understand what really happened when one pilot decided that retreat was not an option and brought everyone home instead. The sky remembered, though. It always did. And tomorrow, when Riven Locke climbed back into her cockpit and flew another mission, the sky would be waiting, indifferent and eternal, ready to be the canvas for whatever came next. Because that's what the sky did. It held space for courage and fear, victory and defeat, life and death, all of it written in contrails and gun smoke and the tracks of aircraft that refused to stay grounded when soldiers needed them. Sleep came finally, deep and dreamless, the sleep of someone who'd done her job well and would wake ready to do it again. The story would spread, growing with each telling, becoming legend and myth, and eventually just another tale told in ready rooms and over beers about the pilot named Graveyard who turned a valley full of enemies into a valley full of silence, and brought home every soul she'd gone there to save. And if the legend was bigger than the reality, well, that was fine too. Sometimes people needed legends more than they needed accuracy. Sometimes the story served a purpose that facts couldn't fulfill. It gave hope, demonstrated courage, and reminded everyone that being underestimated could be a tactical advantage if you were skilled enough to exploit it. Riven Locke slept, and the war continued, and somewhere in the darkness another mission was already being planned that would need her particular combination of skill, stubbornness, and willingness to fly into places that made sane people think twice. When that call came, she'd be ready. She was always ready. That's what Graveyard meant. Not death, but the refusal to let death win. Not endings, but the fierce determination to write different ones than what seemed inevitable. The A-10 sat in its revetment, ugly and scarred and absolutely beautiful to anyone who understood what it represented. Tomorrow, Torres and his crew would have it mission-ready again, because that's what maintenance crews did. They took broken things and made them whole, took empty weapons and filled them, took aircraft that should have been retired decades ago and kept them flying because the mission still needed them. And when the sun rose over Fob Kestrel, bringing another day of heat and dust and danger, the war would continue its ancient rhythms. But for 12 soldiers who'd been pinned in a valley, awaiting a fate they'd started to accept. The sunrise would mean something more. It would mean a second chance they hadn't expected, delivered by a pilot in an aircraft that most people couldn't pick out of a lineup, but that ground troops knew by sight and sound and reputation. That was enough. That had to be enough. In a war without clear endings, you measured victory in lives saved and missions completed. You flew the sortie you were given, made the calls you had to make, and hoped that when the final accounting was done, you'd left things better than you'd found them. Graveyard had done that today. Tomorrow, she'd do it again if needed. That was the job. That was always the job. And she wouldn't have traded it for anything else in the world because this was where she belonged, in that cockpit, pushing that ugly aircraft through dangerous skis, being the answer when someone on the ground called for help. The night deepened, stars emerged above the Afghan mountains, and Fob Kestrel settled into its evening rhythms. In the quiet hours before dawn, when guards walked their posts and nocturnal operations continued in subdued tones, the legend of today's mission was already taking shape. By morning, it would be told a dozen different ways. By next week, it would have reached other bases, other units, other pilots. But the truth would remain, simple and undeniable. When retreat seemed the only option, one pilot had chosen differently and made it work. The rest was just details, and the details would never quite capture what it felt like to be in that valley, hearing that distinctive brrrrrrt overhead, knowing that someone was crazy enough to fly through hell to bring you home. That knowledge would sustain Webb and his platoon through the rest of their deployment and beyond. It would become the story they told their children, the memory they carried when civilian life made military service seem distant and almost unreal. They would remember the day they should have died but didn't, because an A-10 pilot named Graveyard had different plans. And Riven would continue flying mission after mission, knowing that somewhere out there, the next platoon was already walking into danger, the next ambush was being prepared, the next call for help would crackle through her radio. When it did, she'd be ready. She was always ready. That was what being Graveyard meant. Not death. Never death. Instead, it meant being the one who flew into graveyards and brought everyone back alive, who turned endings into continuations, who proved again and again that sometimes the most important skill in combat wasn't following orders but knowing when to write better ones. The mission was over. The day was done. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new chances to prove that courage and competence could overcome being underestimated. For now, sleep claimed her, deep and necessary, the rest of someone who'd earned it. And high above, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human conflicts but bearing witness nonetheless to the moments when individual choices changed outcomes, when one person's refusal to accept defeat created victory from the jaws of certain loss. The universe didn't care about any of it, but the people involved would remember forever. That was enough. It had to be. And when morning came, Graveyard would fly again.